By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
Chapter 1. The salmon and the Sassenach. The mist clung to the peaks of the Highlands like a damp, grey woolen blanket, and the air over Lochdubh smelled of peat smoke and salt water. It was the kind of morning that invited a man to stay in bed with a thick book and a pot of coffee, but PC Hamish Macbeth had more pressing, albeit unofficial, business. He was currently crouched by the banks of the Lochdubh River, his long, lanky frame hidden by a thicket of gorse. His shock of red hair was tucked under a tattered tweed cap, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity on a silver ripple in the dark water. Hamish was not thinking about the law, nor was he thinking about the paperwork piling up in his small police station. He was thinking about butter, lemon, and the delicate pink flakes of a poached salmon. "Easy now, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the ears and fur contraption that was his dog. Lugs gave a low, rumbling whine but remained pinned to the damp earth, with a flick of his wrist that owed more to years of illicit practice than any police academy training. Hamish cast his line. The hook bit. The struggle was brief. Hamish knew these waters better than he knew his own reflection, and moments later, a magnificent 10-pounder was being slipped into a wet burlap sack. "That's us fed for 2 days, lad," Hamish murmured, straightening his back with a groan. His peace, however, was as fleeting as the Highland sunshine. As he climbed back toward the road, the aggressive thwack-thwack of a high-performance engine shattered the silence of the glen. A silver Aston Martin, looking entirely too clean for the mud-spattered roads of Sutherland, roared around the bend, splashing Hamish with a plume of peat-stained water. The car screeched to a halt outside the Lochdubh Hotel. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been curated by a London department store specifically to annoy Highlanders. He wore a crisp linen suit entirely unsuitable for the drizzle, a silk scarf, and an expression of profound boredom. "You there! Constable!" the man shouted, waving a gloved hand at Hamish. Hamish adjusted his cap, his face settling into the mask of vacant, polite stupidity he reserved for the Sassenach's English outsiders who mistook his slow speech for a slow mind. He trudged over, the heavy sack of salmon bumping against his leg. "Aye, sir? Can I be helping you?" Hamish asked, his Highland accent thickening until it was like porridge. "The name is Julian Van Smythe," the man announced, peering at Hamish's muddy boots with distaste. "I've taken the East Wing for the month. I expect my luggage to be handled with care, and I shall require a permit for the fishing. Not that there seems to be anything in this puddle worth catching." Hamish looked at the man's soft hands and the arrogant tilt of his chin. Van Smythe was the sort of Englishman who thought the North began at Watford, and that Scotland was merely a scenic backdrop for his own importance. "Fishing, is it?" Hamish said, his voice a gentle lilt. "Well now, the permits are handled by the estate office, and Thea J. strict. As for the fish, well, Thea shy creatures. They dinner much like the noise of fast cars." Van Smythe sneered. "I am not here for a lecture on local ecology, officer. I am here for the peace. My cousin, the Duke, suggested this godforsaken village was quaint. So far, it's merely damp. See that my trunks are brought in, would you?" "I'm the police, sir, not the porter," Hamish said mildly. "This village, I imagine the roles are interchangeable," Van Smythe snapped, turning on his heel and marching into the hotel. Hamish watched him go, his eyes narrowing. There was a darkness in the newcomer's eyes that didn't match his flashy exterior. Look of a man running away from something, or perhaps running toward a confrontation. "Damp and godforsaken, is it?" Hamish whispered to Lugs. "I think Mr. Van Smythe is going to find that Lochdubh has a very sharp way of biting back." Hamish hefted his poached salmon and began the walk back to the station. The air felt heavier than it had 10 minutes ago. Experience told him that when a man like Van Smythe arrived in a place like this, the peace of the Highlands was about to be served up on a very cold plate. Chapter 2. The kilt and the cold salmon, the interior of the Lochdubh police station, which was also Hamish's kitchen, living room, and general sanctuarismold heavenly. The poached salmon was flaking perfectly in a pan of milk and butter, and a pot of thick black coffee was bubbling on the stove. Hamish sat at the scarred wooden table, his feet up, a copy of the Scottish Field open on his lap. Lugs lay across his boots, occasionally twitching a dream-filled paw. It was the sort of peace Hamish Macbeth would protect with his life. Naturally, it was about to be obliterated. The silence was punctured by a frantic, rhythmic pounding on the heavy oak door. It wasn't the polite tap of a tourist asking for directions, it was the "there's a sheep in the well" or the "pub's run out of export" kind of bang. With a heavy sigh, Hamish didn't move. He hoped that if he remained perfectly still, The intruder might assume he was out on patrol, a concept so foreign to the villagers that it might actually work. Hamish Macbeth, you lazy loon. Open up. It was Archie McLean, the local fisherman, and a man whose capacity for drama was exceeded only by his capacity for gin. The door isn't locked, Archie, Hamish called out, his voice weary, and unless the sea has turned into malt whiskey, I dinna see the need for such a racket. Archie burst in, his yellow oilskins dripping onto Hamish's clean floor. He was pale, his eyes wide behind his salt-crusted spectacles. It's the Englishman, Hamish, the flashy one from the hotel. He's in the square, and he's looking peculiar. Peculiar how? Hamish asked, finally lowering his feet. Is he complaining about the damp again? I canna risk the weather, Archie. He's dead, Hamish. Dead as a tinned herring. And well, you'd best just come see. Hamish grabbed his uniform jacket, which had seen better days, and was currently missing a button, and whistled for lugs. As they stepped out into the biting Highland wind, the drizzle had turned into a steady, spiteful needles and pins rain. A small crowd had already gathered near the village war memorial, a granite obelisk that stood defiantly against the grey sky. In the centre of the square sat the tourist thrown near a heavy, carved wooden chair intended for photo opportunities. There sat Julian Van Smythe. The sight was enough to make even Hamish, who had seen his share of oddities, pause in his tracks. Van Smythe was slumped in the chair, his head lolling to one side, but it was his attire that drew the eye. Someone had stripped him of his expensive linen suit and dressed him in a full, albeit garish, tourist shop Highland outfit. Oh! He wore a kilt of a generic acrylic tartan, a sporran that looked like a dead rabbit, and a See You Jimmy hat with fake orange hair attached to the brim. To add a final, cruel flourish, the kilt had been put on backwards. Lord help us, Hamish muttered, pushing through the whispering locals. Move back, now. Mrs. Kennedy, this is no a sideshow for the bairns. Away with you. Hamish knelt beside the body. Up close, the breezy humour of the costume vanished. Julian's face was a mottled dark purple, and his eyes were fixed in a stare of pure, unadulterated terror. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no blood on the heather-patterned vest. While the villagers gossiped, Hamish did what he did best. He looked at what wasn't there. The hands. Julian's fingernails were too clean for a man who might have fought off an attacker. The shoes. He was wearing his own expensive Italian loafers, which were caked in a very specific type of black, oily mud found only near the old pier. The scent. Beneath the smell of wet wool and the salt spray, there was a faint, cloying aroma. Not whiskey, not perfume. It smelled like bitter almonds. Right, Hamish said, standing up and dusting his knees. Archie, go to the hotel and tell them to call the doctor, and tell them to keep the tourists away from the windows. Is it a heart attack, Hamish? Mrs. Gillespie, the postmistress, chirped from the edge of the crowd. He looked a bit high-strung, did he know? A heart attack does no usually dress you in a ginger wig and a backwards kilt, Mrs. Gillespie, Hamish said dryly. He looked down at the dead man. Julian Van Smythe had come to Lochdubh looking for peace and quiet, and he had certainly found it, albeit in the most humiliating fashion possible. But Hamish wasn't thinking about the tragedy. He was thinking about the fact that a murder meant the big men from Strathbane would be coming. It meant sirens, it meant shouting, and it meant his salmon was currently overcooking on the stove. Lugs, Hamish sighed, patting the dog's head. I think our quiet month just went up in smoke. And God help us, because if I'm no mistaken, that scent means someone has been playing with the local chemist's supplies. He looked toward the road leading out of the village. Already he could hear the faint, distant wail of a police siren. DCI Blair was on his way, and Hamish knew that before the day was out, he'd be blamed for the rain, the murder, and the state of the Scottish economy. Chapter 3. The bluster of Blair, the silence of Lochdubh was not merely broken, it was shattered, ground into the peat, and tossed into the sea. 3 police cruisers from Strathbane, their blue lights flashing with an urgency that seemed entirely unnecessary in a village with one main road, roared into the square. The lead car came to a skidding halt, narrowly missing a startled sheep. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. If a heart attack were a person, it would look like Blair. He was a man of high blood pressure and low patience, with a face the colour of an overripe plum and a belly that strained against the buttons of a cheap, shiny suit. He stepped into a deep puddle, cursed the entire county of Sutherland, and turned his predatory gaze toward Hamish. Macbeth, Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the granite walls of the grocery shop. What in the name of God is this circus? I get a call about a homicide, and I find the victim looking like a souvenir shop threw up on him. Hamish stood by the war memorial, his hands deep in his pockets, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus that was 3 days late. Good morning to you too, sir. It's a messy business, to be sure. Blair stomped over, followed by his two shadows, Detectives Macnab and Anderson, who shared their boss' disdain for anything north of the Great Glen. Blair looked down at the late Julian Van Smythe. He let out a sharp, barking laugh. "I see you, Jimmy Hat? A backwards kilt? This isn't a murder, Macbeth. It's a local prank gone wrong. Some of your drunken crofter friends probably tried to welcome the Sassenach and gave him a fright. Look at him, not a mark on him. Heart failure brought on by sheer embarrassment, ill bet. He does look a bit startled, sir," Hamish said mildly, his accent sliding into a slow, rhythmic drawl. "But I was thinking, the smell, sir, it's a bit like almonds. And the mud on his shoes, I don't pay you to think. Macbeth. In fact, I am fairly certain the taxpayer doesn't pay you to do anything but poach salmon and grow that ridiculous hair," Blair snapped. He leaned over the body, his face inches from Julian's purple skin. "Almonds! That's your stomach talking, no doubt. You're probably dreaming of marzipan. It's the rain, you fool. It brings out the scent of the heather." Macnab sniggered. Anderson made a show of checking his high-tech digital camera, pointedly ignoring Hamish's muddy boots. Now, Blair spun around, his eyes locking onto Archie McLean, who was still shivering by the hotel entrance. "Who found the body?" "Archie did, sir," Hamish replied. "He was just coming up from the right." "You!" McLean. Blair stomped toward the trembling fisherman. "Why did you kill him? Was it a dispute over a lobster pot? Did he look at your wife funny? Or did you just decide the English were getting too thick on the ground?" Archie's jaw dropped. "Kill him? I barely knew the man. I just found him sitting there like a window display." "A likely story," Blair sneered, poking a finger into Archie's chest. "You've got the look of a killer, McLean. Shifty, smelling of fish. I've seen your type in a dozen dockside brawls. Macnab, take this man to the station. We'll see how his story holds up after 4 hours in a room that doesn't smell like seaweed." "But sir," Hamish intervened, his voice a model of humble concern, "Archie's been at sea since 4 this morning. The Willian was seen leaving the harbour by half the village. He only just docked." Blair turned on Hamish, his eyes bulging. "Are you telling me how to conduct a murder investigation, Macbeth? You're a glorified traffic warden in a place that has no traffic. If I want your opinion, well, I'll never want your opinion. Get out of my sight. Go find a cat up a tree or something equally suited to your talents." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound. "As you wish, sir. He'll just be taking lugs for a wee walk then. To stay out of your hair. Do that. And stay away from the crime scene." "I don't want your ginger hairs contaminating the forensics," Blair barked, turning back to roar at a group of gawking tourists. Hamish turned and walked slowly toward the Andub River, lugs trotting at his heels. To any observer, he looked like a defeated man, a lazy village Bobby bullied into submission. But behind his hooded eyes, Hamish's mind was moving with the precision of a clockmaker. He knew Archie McLean couldn't kill a fly without apologizing to it first. He knew that the bitter almond scent was the unmistakable calling card of cyanide. And most importantly, he had noticed something Blair had completely missed in his rush to bully a local. Julian Van Smythe's expensive silk scarf was missing, but there was a faint, red line around his neck that suggested it hadn't been removed gently. "He thinks it's a prank, lugs," Hamish whispered as they reached the shelter of a weeping willow. "But you don't dress a man in a wig and a kilt unless you want the world to look at the clothes and not the person." Our Mr. Van Smythe was hated by someone with a very nasty sense of humour. Hamish sat on a damp stone, pulled a small thermos from his pocket, and poured a cup of lukewarm coffee. He would let Blair shout. He would let Blair arrest poor Archie. And while the big men were busy making noise, Hamish would do what he did best. He would go for a mooch. Chapter 4. Tea, gossip, and bitter truths the rain in Lochdubh had a way of seeping into a man's bones, and Hamish Macbeth decided that his bones had suffered quite enough for one morning. While DCI Blair was busy turning the police station into a theatre of shouting and cigar smoke, Hamish beat a strategic retreat toward the village's true centre of intelligence, the post office and general store. Mrs. Gillespie, the postmistress, was a woman who saw the world through the slit of a registered mail envelope. She was currently rearranging a display of tinned peas with more vigour than was strictly necessary, her eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. "Is he still at it, Hamish?" she asked as the bell above the door jingled. "That man from Strathbane?" I could hear him bellowing all the way from the War Memorial. A very coarse individual. "He's a man of great energy, Mrs. Gillespie," Hamish said mildly, leaning against the counter. and looking longingly at a tray of fresh scones. "And a man of great energy needs a lot of noise to keep it going. I don't suppose there's a drop of tea in that pot of yours? It's a cold day for a murder." "Sit yourself down, Hamish. You look like a drowned rat," she sighed, though her eyes twinkled. She poured him a mug of tea so strong it could have stripped paint and pushed a buttered scone toward him. A terrible business. That poor Mr. Vansmythe, dressed up like a pantomime dame. Who would do such a thing? "That's what the DCI's asking Archie McLaren," Hamish said, taking a large, appreciative bite. "Archie, don't be daft. Archie hasn't the imagination to dress a salad, let alone a corpse," Mrs. Gillespie scoffed. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But he'll tell you who did have words with the gentleman. 2 days ago, a registered letter arrived for him. From a firm of solicitors in London, Blackwood and Finch. He opened it right here in the shop. He turned the colour of a boiled turnip, Hamish. He looked positively murderous." Hamish stirred his tea slowly. "Did he now? And did he say anything?" "Only a few choice words that I wouldn't repeat in a house of God. But then, yesterday, a car of very sensible grey Volvo. Not like that flashy thing of his stopped by the hotel. A woman got out. Tall, very elegant. The kind of woman who wears pearls to breakfast. She asked for him, and they went for a walk toward the old pier. They weren't holding hands, Hamish. They were arguing. I could see the way she was shaking her umbrella at him." Hamish committed sensible grey Volvo and pearls to his mental filing cabinet. "Thank you, Mrs. Gillespie. You're a pillar of the community." "I tried to keep my eyes open," she said primly, "unlike some I could mention." Hamish finished his tea and wandered back out into the drizzle. His next stop was the Taj Mahal of the North, a tiny curry shop that had defied all odds to survive in a village where the most exotic spice usually encountered was white pepper. Mr. Patel, the owner, was currently wiping down his 3 tables with a look of profound melancholy. "Mr. Macbeth," Patel greeted him, "a sad day. Very bad for the tourist trade to have bodies sitting in the square. It suggests the hospitality is lacking." "It's a bit of a dampener, Mr. Patel," Hamish agreed. "Did the deceased ever sample your excellent lamb korma?" "He did not," Patel said, his lip curling slightly. "He came in once, looked at the menu, and asked if I could make him a proper English roast beef. I told him this was a curry house. He told me I was wasting my time in a place like this, and that the locals wouldn't know a good meal if it bit them. He was a very difficult man to please. And did he have any visitors here? Or anyone watching him?" Patel paused, his rag hovering over a tabletop. "Last night, very late, I was closing up. I saw him walking toward the pier again, but he wasn't alone. There was a man with him short, heavy set, wearing a dark mackintosh. They were speaking very quietly, very seriously. The stranger didn't look like a tourist. He looked like, well, like the kind of men who used to hang around the docks in Glasgow. Not Highland men." Hamish nodded, his mind whirring. A London solicitor's letter, a woman with pearls and an umbrella, and a heavy-set man from the docks. Oh. Julian Vansmythe hadn't just come to Lochdubh for the peace he had come, because he was involved in something that spanned from the high society of London to the rougher edges of the south. "Thank you, Mr. Patel. If the DCI comes in, Aide mention the roast beef. He likes a man who knows his meat." Hamish stepped back out into the rain, lugs waiting patiently under the eaves. He had learned more in 20 minutes of mooching than Blair would learn in 20 hours of interrogation. But the biggest question remained. Why the "see you Jimmy" hat? Why the backwards kilt? In the Highlands, if you wanted to kill a man, you shot him or hit him. You didn't play dress-up with him unless you were trying to send a message. And that message, Hamish suspected, was one of profound contempt. "Right, lugs," Hamish said, pulling his collar up. "I think it's time we paid a visit to the big house. I need to see if Priscilla has heard anything about our royal visitor and his London solicitors." Chapter 5. The Lady of the Loch, the gates of Tommel Castle, were as imposing as a Victorian schoolmistress, and twice as cold. Hamish guided his battered Land Rover vehicle that smelled perpetually of wet dog and old wool up the winding drive. The gravel crunched under his tyres with a sound like breaking bones, a sharp contrast to the soft, rhythmic splashing of the rain against the windscreen. Luggs sat in the passenger seat, his head tilting as they passed the perfectly manicured hedges that Priscilla's father, Colonel Halberton Smythe, insisted on maintaining despite the Highland weather's best efforts to turn everything into a bog. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest. It wasn't just the castle, it was Priscilla. To the rest of the world, Priscilla Halberton Smythe was a cool, blonde aristocrat with a voice like silk and a mind like a razor. To Hamish, she was the one who got away, the one who stayed, and the one who made him feel like he was wearing someone else's trousers every time they spoke. He found her in the morning room, which was filled with the kind of pale, expensive furniture that made Hamish want to apologize for having a spine. She was dressed in a cashmere sweater the colour of a winter sky, a string of pearls glowing against her throat. "Hamish," she said, looking up from a book. A small knowing smile touched her lips. "I wondered how long it would take for you to come seeking sanctuary from DCI Blair. I hear he's currently trying to indict the entire fishing fleet for treason. He's a man of grand visions, Priscilla," Hamish said, carefully lowering himself into a chair that felt far too delicate for a man of his height. "Mostly visions of himself getting a medal in London. But I'm no here for sanctuary. I'm here for a bit of that aristocratic insight you're so famous for." Priscilla set her book aside and stood. "You look half frozen. I'll get some coffee and those ginger biscuits you like, the ones the cook hides from my father." A few minutes later, Hamish was clutching a delicate china cup which he feared he might crush through sheer clumsiness and feeling the warmth return to his fingers. The biscuits were excellent. "Julian Van Smythe," Hamish began, his voice dropping an octave. "He was a cousin of yours?" Priscilla's expression cooled. "A very distant one, thank goodness." The Smythe part of his name was a recent addition, mostly for the benefit of creditors and social climbers. "Julian was what my father calls a professional guest. He lived on invitations, charm, and the occasional bit of, well, let's call it social facilitation. He was known as the Royal, according to a memo I saw on Blair's desk," Hamish prompted. Priscilla laughed, though there was no mirth in it. "Oh, that. Julian once claimed to be the illegitimate grandson of a minor European prince. It was complete nonsense, of course, but it worked wonders for getting him into the right weekend parties. But the royal scandal part, that's more recent. He was involved in a very messy business in London, involving a set of stolen lettuce lighters belonging to a woman very high up in the social hierarchy. If they had been published, several marriages, and perhaps a small government, would have collapsed." Hamish leaned forward. "And where are those letters now?" "Nobody knows." Julian claimed they were lost. "The solicitors, Blackwood and Finch, have been trying to track him for months. They thought he might have hidden them somewhere safe, like a quiet village in the Highlands where the policeman is too lazy to notice a stranger in his midst," Hamish mused. "Precisely," Priscilla said. She looked at him intently, her blue eyes searching his face. "But there's something else. Is Enty there? The way he was found. It wasn't just a murder, Hamish. It was a joke." "Aye, the see you Jimmy hat and the backwards kilt," Hamish nodded. "It's a specific kind of insult, Priscilla. It's saying you thought you were a prince, but you're just a cheap tourist. It's the kind of thing a local would do to a Sassenach they hated. But Julian only arrived yesterday. He hadn't had time to make enemies of that caliber here. Unless, Priscilla suggested softly, the enemy followed him. Or unless he was here to meet someone he already knew. Hamish thought of the woman in the grey Volvo and the heavy-set man Mr. Patel had seen at the pier. He was meeting people, all right. But why the cyanide? It's a clean way to kill, but a messy way to leave a body. And why take his scarf? Priscilla walked to the window, looking out at the mist-shrouded loch. In Julian's world, everything is about appearances. To kill him is one thing. To humiliate him in death, that takes a very personal kind of hatred, or a very clever distraction. Hamish stood up, feeling the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. He looked at Priscilla, so elegant and composed, and felt the familiar tug of the social chasm between them. "I'd best be getting back," he said. "Blair will be wondering why the village idiot hasn't been around to be shouted at." "Hamish," Priscilla called out as he reached the door. "Be careful. Julian wasn't just a liar, he was a blackmailer. And blackmailers usually keep a dead man's handle something that comes out if they disappear. If that something is in Lochdubh, Julian might not be the last person to die for it." Hamish nodded, his face grim. "I'll keep my eyes open, Priscilla. And thank you for the biscuits. They are the only thing that's made sense all day." As he drove back down the gravel path, Hamish wasn't thinking about the letters or the stolen letters. He was thinking about the red line around Julian's neck. If he had been poisoned with cyanide, why was there a mark of strangulation? "He was dead twice over. Lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog. Someone wanted to be absolutely sure that the Royal never spoke again. Chapter 6. The red herring revealed the Lochdubh police station was currently less of a place of law and more of a pressurized boiler. DCI Blair was in the small interview room, his voice muffled by the thick door but still carrying the unmistakable vibration of a man who thought he had just won the lottery. Hamish sat in the outer office, ostensibly filing reports on sheep worrying, but actually listening with the practiced ear of a deer stalker. Beside him, Lugs was chewing on a stray piece of rope, occasionally looking up with a skeptical expression that mirrored his master's. "I have you now, you posh harpy," Blair's voice boomed. The door swung open and Blair emerged, looking fit to burst with triumph. Behind him, looking remarkably composed given the circumstances, was the woman from the grey Volvo. Up close, she was even more formidable than Mrs. Gillespie had described. Her pearls were real, her tweed suit was tailored to within an inch of its life, and her eyes held the cold grey light of the North Sea. "Macbeth," Blair barked. "Meet Mrs. Fiona Sterling. Or should I say, the woman who decided Lochdubh was a convenient place for a bit of widow-making." "Is that so, sir?" Hamish asked, standing up slowly and offering a polite, albeit vacant, nod to the lady. "A pleasure to meet you, Mom. I am sorry about the weather. It's no usually this..." accusatory. "This woman," Blair continued, ignoring Hamish pleasantries, was seen arguing with Van Smythe at the pier. "We found his silk scarf, one missing from the body stuffed into the glove compartment of her Volvo. And she's a Sterling, the Sterlings of London. They've been in the papers for months over some financial irregularity. Van Smythe was their fixer. He knew where the bodies were buried, and she decided to make him one of them." Fiona Sterling crossed her arms, her gaze flicking to Hamish as if searching for a glimmer of intelligence in the room. "As I have told this person," she said, indicating Blair with a sharp chin, "Julian was a family friend. We had a disagreement over a private matter. The scarf was a gift he had returned to me. I did not kill him, and I certainly didn't dress him up like a tourist attraction. I have some taste, a likely story." Blair sneered. "MacNab is currently searching her hotel room for the cyanide. I've already called the super. I am taking her to Strathbane in an hour. This case is closed, Macbeth. You can go back to your poaching." Hamish scratched his ear. "It's a grand theory, sir. Truly. Most impressive. But I was wondering, did you happen to look at Mrs. Sterling's shoes?" Blair froze. "Her shoes? What the devil are you talking about, man? Are you opening a boutique?" "It's just," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a soft apologetic lilt, "the mud, sir. The mud on poor Mr. Van Smythe's loafers was black and oily. It's the kind of sludge you only find down by the old pier where the herring boats used to rot. But Mrs. Sterling's shoes and the tyres of her Volvo are covered in a very fine red clay. That's the clay from the north side of the estate near the castle. There isn't a speck of pier mud on her." Blair's face began its familiar transition from plum to eggplant. "So she changed her shoes? Or she stayed in the car?" "Aye, sir, she could have," Hamish agreed. "But then there's the matter of the cat." "The cat?" Blair roared. "What cat?" "Mrs. Sterling's cat," Hamish said, pointing to a small designer cat carrier sitting near the door. A very fluffy, very bored-looking Persian was peering out from behind the mesh. "Mrs. Sterling told the hotel clerk she'd been out walking her darling all morning because he hates the car. But I noticed the cat's paws are bone dry. If she'd been out at the pier in this rain, even with an umbrella, that beast would look like a wet mop. It means she wasn't at the pier when the murder happened. She was likely tucked up in the hotel library, as the night porter says he saw her, reading a book on 18th century porcelain." Fiona Sterling raised an eyebrow, a flicker of respect crossing her face. "Thank you, Constable. It was actually 17th century, but the point stands." Blair looked from the cat to the mud to Hamish. For a moment, it looked like he might explode. "I don't care about feline hygiene, Macbeth. I found the scarf. That's physical evidence. But, sir," Hamish said gently, "if you were going to kill a man and take a trophy, would you put it in your glove box and then drive around the village where the police are crawling? It's almost as if someone wanted you to find it. Someone who knew exactly what kind of car Mrs. Sterling drove." Blair let out a sound like a punctured tyre. He turned his rage on Mrs. Sterling. "Yeah! Stay in the village. If you so much as look at a car key, he'll have you in irons." He stormed into his office and slammed the door so hard the police sign on the wall rattled. Hamish sighed and looked at Mrs. Sterling. "He'll be a bit grumpy for a while, Mum. I'd stay away from the station if I were you. You're not as stupid as you look, are you, Constable?" she asked, her voice cool and clinical. Hamish gave her his most vacant smile. "Oh, I am just a simple village bobby, Mum. I just spend a lot of time looking at feet. It's a hobby of mine." As she left, Hamish's smile vanished. "Oh." He walked over to the desk and picked up a piece of paper. It was the list of items found on Julian's body. He had noticed something earlier that he hadn't told Blair. Julian Van Smythe had been found with a "See You Jimmy" hat, a backwards kilt, and a sporran, but the list didn't mention his original trousers. If someone had dressed him, they had to have taken his trousers somewhere. And in a village as small as Lochdubh, you can't just throw a pair of $1,000 Italian wool trousers in the bin without someone noticing. The scarf was a plant. Lugs, Hamish whispered. And if Mrs. Sterling isn't the killer, then we're looking for someone who knows the village well enough to hide a pair of trousers and frame a London socialite. He looked out the window. The mist was thinning, revealing the old pier in the distance. And standing there, a solitary figure in a dark mackintosh was watching the station. Chapter 7. The hidden motive. The fog was beginning to lift, peeling away from the loch in ragged white strips to reveal a sky the colour of a bruised plum. Hamish Macbeth stood on the old stone pier, the wind whipping his red hair into a frantic halo. He wasn't looking at the water, he was looking at a small, discarded bit of plastic snagged in the cracks of the masonry. He bent down, his long fingers plucking it up. It was a price tag from the Highland Emporium, a dusty shop 3 villages over that specialised in the kind of cheap, plastic souvenirs that real Scotsmen avoided like a midge's nest. Lugs, Hamish said. The DCI thinks this was a crime of high finance and London secrets. He thinks the royal was killed for what he knew about dukes and bankers. He turned the tag over. See you, Jimmy hat, £4, 99. But you don't use a £5 hat to kill a man over £1 million. You use it because you want to make him look small. You use it because you want to take a man who thought he was a prince and turn him into a joke. Hamish left the pier and headed back toward the village, but he didn't go to the police station. Instead, he made his way to the back entrance of the Lochdubh Hotel, slipping into the kitchens where the smell of roasting lamb and floor wax reigned supreme. He found Mary, the young laundry girl, sitting on a crate and weeping softly into a tea towel. Mary was a quiet creature, the kind of girl who moved through the village like a shadow, unnoticed and unthanked. "Now then, Mary," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its most soothing melodic Highland lilt. "What's all this? Has the manager been giving you a hard time about the linens?" Mary looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "It's no the manager, Hamish. It's the dead man, Mr. Van Smythe." Hamish leaned against the industrial washer, looking as relaxed as a cat in a sunbeam. "A difficult man, I hear. Very demanding. He was a devil," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "He caught me in the hallway yesterday. He saw the locket I wear, the one with my brother's picture. My brother who passed last winter in the North Sea." Hamish nodded. The village still felt the sting of that particular tragedy. He laughed. "Hamish," Mary choked out. "He told me it was a cheap piece of sentimental trash. He said people like us their lowly croftus were like the sheep on the hillside. We lived, we died, and nobody of importance ever noticed. He said my brother was likely a drunk who couldn't stay on a boat. He mocked his memory just to watch me cry." Hamish felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. It was the dark undercurrent that often moved beneath his breezy exterior. He knew the tight men like Van Smythe didn't just want money, they wanted to feel superior by crushing the dignity of those they deemed lesser. And was he mocking anyone else, Mary? Did he ever go at Geordie, the handyman? Mary wiped her nose. He did. Geordie was fixing a leak in his room. Mr. Van Smythe told him he was a clumsy oaf, and that he'd have him sacked before the week was out. Geordie's worked here 30 years, Hamish. His whole life is that job. Hamish patted Mary's hand and left the kitchen. He walked into the cool air of the courtyard, his mind clicking into place. Blair was looking for a grand motive blackmail, stolen letters, international scandal, but Hamish knew Lochdubh. In a place where history was long and pride was the only thing some people had left, a mocked brother or a threatened livelihood was worth more than all the silk scarves in London. He thought back to the bitter almonds. Cyanide. It wasn't just a poison for spies. In the Highlands it was found in old bottles of wasp killer and certain agricultural pesticides. Every shed in the village probably had a dusty jar of it sitting on a high shelf. And then there were the trousers. Hamish detoured to the hotel's heavy-duty outdoor bins. He began to poke through them with a long stick, ignoring the smell of fish guts and old cabbage. Near the bottom, tucked inside a black bin liner that had been weighted down with stones, he found them. Julian Van Smythe's bespoke Italian wool trousers. They were ruined, slashed to ribbons, as if by someone in a blind, shaking rage. But it wasn't the damage that caught Hamish's eye. It was what was pinned to the waistband. A small, hand-knitted badge of a thistle kind Geordie the handyman wore on his cap. "Oh, Geordie," Hamish sighed, looking up at the darkening mountains. "You were trying to be helpful, weren't you? You told Blair you saw Archie at the pier. You were the invisible man who was always there to hold the door or carry a bag. The motive wasn't the royal scandal. The motive was that Julian Van Smythe had been a cruel man in a village that looked after its own. He had stepped on the pride of people who had nothing else, and he had done it once too often." But as Hamish looked at the ruined trousers, he noticed something else, something Geordie couldn't have known. There was a small waterproof pouch sewn into the lining of the pocket. Hamish carefully pried it open. Inside were the letters, the real royal scandal. Hamish looked at them for a long moment. If he handed these to Blair, Blair would be promoted, and Hamish would be dragged along with him to a desk in Strathbane, away from the loch, away from the salmon, and away from the peace he craved. "Lugs," Hamish said, his eyes narrowing. "It's time to set a trap. Not just for a killer, but for a DCI who thinks he's too clever for his own good." He tucked the letters into his own tunic and headed toward the pub. He needed to spread a rumour, and in Lochdubh, a rumour travelled faster than a Highland gale. Chapter 8. The trap is set. The Tommel Arms was the kind of establishment where the walls had ears, the floorboards had memories, and the peat smoke hanging in the rafters acted as a sort of local internet, transmitting secrets from one corner of the room to the other. It was the perfect place for a man who wanted to be overheard. Hamish Macbeth entered the pub with the slow, deliberate tread of a man who had spent the day doing a great deal of nothing and was exhausted by the effort. His uniform was rumpled, his red hair was a wind-blown thicket, and he looked, to any casual observer, like a policeman who had entirely given up on the concept of law and order. "A pint of the 80 shilling, please, Barney," Hamish said, leaning heavily against the brass rail of the bar. "And perhaps a small dram of the Laphroaig. I've a chill in my bones that a furnace wouldn't touch." Barney, the barman, slid the glass over. "DCI Blair was in here an hour ago, Hamish, looking for you. He said if I saw you, I was to tell you that you're on the verge of a career in sheep counting if you don't report in." Hamish took a long, appreciative sip of the whiskey, closing his eyes as the liquid peat fire slid down his throat. The DCI is a man of great passion, Barney, but he's a city man. He thinks a case is solved by shouting at the suspects until they get a headache and confess. He does not understand that in Lochdubh, things take a wee bit of time to settle, like a good stew. Archie McLean, recently released from Blair's clutches and looking significantly worse for wear, was sitting at the end of the bar. "He nearly had me in the cells, Hamish. He said I had the eyes of a strangler." "You have the eyes of a man who spent too long looking at mackerel, Archie," Hamish said with a wink. He then raised his voice just a fraction, not enough to sound unnatural, but enough to ensure the conversation reached the shadows of the corner booths. "Besides, the DCI is looking at the wrong things. He's looking at scarves and socialites. He should be looking at the rubbish." The pub went unusually quiet. The clink of glasses softened. "The rubbish, Hamish," Barney prompted. "Why?" "I was poking about the hotel bins earlier, strictly unofficial. Mein Dan Voss found a pair of trousers. Very expensive trousers. And inside a secret little pocket. Well, I found what everyone's been looking for." Hamish reached into his tunic and patted a lump that looked suspiciously like a bundle of letters. He let out a long, theatrical sigh. The royal scandal itself. Letters that would make a bishop blush and a duke pack his bags for South America. "I suppose I should have taken them straight to Blair, but the man is in such a foul temper. I thought I'd let him sleep on it. I've tucked them into the old safe at the station, the one with the dodgy lock that everyone knows about. I'll hand them over at 8 in the morning, and then, God willing, the big men will take their sirens and their shouting back to Strathbane and leave us in peace." "You're leaving them in the station, alone?" Mrs. Kennedy asked from her table by the fire. "Is that no dangerous, Hamish? Who'd be bothering a poor village bobby?" Hamish said, waving a hand dismissively as he drained his glass. "Besides, I am that tired I could sleep through a Highland Games. I am going back to the station, locking the doormost and putting my feet up. If anyone wants a scandal, they'll have to wait for the morning light." He paid for his drink, whistled for lugs, and stumbled slightly as he made his way to the door. He looked every inch the useless peasant Blair had accused him of being, a man who had stumbled onto a fortune and was too lazy to guard it properly. As the door closed behind him, the Tommel Arms erupted into a low, frantic buzzing of whispers. Outside, the mist had returned, thicker than before. Hamish didn't walk back to the station immediately. He stood in the shadow of the grocery shop, his face transformed. The vacant, sleepy look was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. "Did you see them, Lugs?" he whispered, the eyes in the corner. Not the ones looking for a story, but the ones looking for a way out. He had seen the flicker of movement in the reflection of the bar mirror. Geordie, the handyman, had been sitting in the darkest booth, his cap pulled low. Geordie, who had been so helpful in pointing Blair toward the pier. Geordie, who knew exactly how dodgy the lock on the station door was, because he had been the one who failed to fix it 3 years ago. Hamish walked back to the station, but he didn't turn on the lights. He didn't put his feet up. He sat in the dark, in the uncomfortable wooden chair behind his desk, with lugs at his feet and a heavy iron poker from the stove resting across his knees. He wasn't waiting for a professional criminal. He wasn't waiting for a London assassin. He was waiting for a man whose pride had been wounded and who believed that the village policeman was too stupid to see through a "see you, Jimmy" hat. "Hell come, lugs," Hamish breathed into the darkness. "Because a man like that canna bear the thought of a lazy loon like me holding his life in my pocket. He thinks him a fool. And that, God help him, is the only weapon I need." The rain began to drum a steady rhythmic beat on the corrugated iron roof of the station. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. The confrontation, the darkness in the Lochdubh police station was not absolute. The embers in the small peat stove cast a faint, dying orange glow across the floorboards, and the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the corrugated iron roof provided a hypnotic soundtrack to Hamish's vigil. He sat perfectly still, the iron poker resting across his knees, his breathing shallow and even. Beside him, Lugs was a silent shadow, his ears twitching at sounds far beyond the range of human hearing. Then it happened. A soft metallic scrapeth sound of a skeleton key being introduced to a lock that had long since lost its integrity. The door creaked on its hinges, a groan of protest that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. A figure slipped inside, silhouetted against the grey, misty light of the square. The intruder was thick-set and moved with the heavy, slightly rolling gait of a man used to navigating uneven hillsides and slippery decks. He didn't turn on the light. Instead, he produced a small, hooded torch, its thin beam cutting through the gloom like a needle. The light darted across the room, past the filing cabinet, past the empty tea mugs, and settled on the small green safe tucked beneath Hamish's desk. The figure knelt, his heavy mackintosh rustling. He reached for the handle, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches of desperation. "It's no locked, Geordie," Hamish said, his voice quiet and conversational. "I told you at the pub the mechanism is temperamental. You only have to give it a firm tug." The figure froze. The torch beam jerked upward, bathing Hamish's face in a harsh, white glare. Geordie, the hotel handyman, stared at him, his weathered face twisted into a mask of terror and fury. His eyes, usually so dull and compliant, were wide and gleaming with a frantic light. "Hamish," Geordie wheezed, the torch trembling in his hand. "I just came to—" The window was rattling. "I thought I'd fix the catch for you. At 2 in the morning in the pouring rain with a skeleton key in your pocket." Hamish stood up slowly, his tall, lanky frame unfolding like a carpenter's rule. He didn't raise the poker, but he kept it ready. "Sit down, Geordie. My legs are aching, and I imagine yours are too after all that walking back and forth to the pier." Geordie didn't sit. He backed away toward the door, the torchlight dancing wildly across the ceiling. "I don't know what you're havering about, Macbeth. I am a respectable man. Not like that Sassenach filth." "That filth mocked your Mary," Hamish said, his voice hardening. "He mocked her dead brother. He told you that you were nothing but a servant, easily replaced and soon forgotten. He stepped on the pride of a man who's lived in this village since before the hotel had indoor plumbing. And that's a dangerous thing to do to a Highlander, is it no?" Geordie stopped retreating. His shoulders slumped, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat. He was a devil, Hamish. A preening, cruel devil. He laughed when I told him my father built the very stone walls he was sneering at. He said we were all picturesque peasants kept here for his amusement. He deserved to die, but he deserved to be laughed at first. I wanted everyone to see him for the joke he was. "The wasp killer, Geordie?" Hamish asked. "I remember you telling me last summer you had a bottle of the old stuff the potassium cyanide in the garden shed." "I put it in his flask," Geordie whispered. "He always took a nip of brandy before his walk. He didn't even notice. He died right there on the pier, gasping like a fish out of water. I dressed him there. I had the clothes in a sack. I wanted him to look like the cheap, plastic rubbish he thought we were. I sat him in that chair to show the village that even a royal can be made a fool. And the letters? I didn't care about the letters. I didn't even know they were there until I was cutting up his trousers to hide them. I saw the pouch. I thought if the police found them, they'd think it was a big city job, a professional hit. Which is why you planted the scarf in Mrs. Sterling's car." Hamish nodded. "You're a clever man, Geordie, but you're no a killer at heart. A real killer wouldn't have left his own thistle badge pinned to the evidence." Geordie's face went pale. He looked down at his empty lapel, then back at Hamish. The desperation in his eyes turned to a sudden sharp panic. He realized that the lazy loon had caught him. With a roar of frustrated rage, Geordie lunged. He was a powerful man, built of muscle and Highland grit, and he hit Hamish with the force of a falling pine. The two men crashed into the desk, sending papers and cold coffee dregs flying. Lugs erupted into a frenzy of barking, snapping at Geordie's heels. Hamish was thinner, but he had the deceptive strength of a man who spent his days hauling sheep out of bogs. He locked his long arms around Geordie's chest, trying to pin him, but the handyman was slick with rain and driven by the strength of the condemned. They rolled across the floor, over chairs and boots, a messy, undignified scramble of limbs. Geordie managed to get a hand around Hamish's throat, his thumbs pressing into the windpipe. Hamish's vision began to swim, the orange glow of the stove blurring into a haze. He reached out, his fingers groping across the floor until they found the iron poker he had dropped. He didn't swing it. He jammed the cold metal between Geordie's shins and twisted. With a cry of pain, Geordie lost his balance. Hamish bucked upward, throwing the heavier man off him. Before Geordie could recover, Hamish was on top of him, his knee pressed firmly into the small of Geordie's back, pinning his arms behind him. "Easy now, Geordie," Hamish gasped, his breath coming in ragged gulps. "It's over. You've done enough. Don't make me call Lugs off hasn't had his breakfast yet, and he's jay fond of ankles." Geordie went limp. He began to sob, the sound of a man who had held his dignity until it broke him. He laughed at the dead, Hamish. He laughed at the dead. "I know, Geordie," Hamish said softly, reaching for his handcuffs. "I know he did. But the law doesn't care about a man's manners, only his life." As the metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the small station, the first grey light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Hamish sat on the floor beside his prisoner, his uniform ruined and his throat aching, wondering how on earth he was going to Chapter 10. The credits shift the morning sun, rare and fragile, struggled to pierce the remaining curtains of mist hanging over Lochdubh. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the smell of scorched coffee and the heavy, damp scent of a man who had spent the night in a state of spiritual and physical collapse. Geordie sat in the corner cell, his head in his hands, silent now that the weight of his secret had been lifted. Hamish Macbeth, however, was a whirlwind of uncharacteristic activity. He wasn't cleaning, that would have been a step too far, but he was carefully rearranging the evidence on his desk. He took the royal scandal letters, still in their waterproof pouch, and placed them partially under a stack of Blair's own messy paperwork. He then took the price tag from the "See You Jimmy" hat and dropped it into Blair's overflowing ashtray. When the familiar, aggressive roar of a police cruiser signalled the arrival of the DCI, Hamish slunked into his chair, adopted an expression of profound, gormless exhaustion, and waited. The door flew open. DCI Blair marched in, looking like a man who had slept in a hedge and been woken up by a lawnmower. His eyes were bloodshot, and his temper was clearly on a hair trigger. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, slamming a folder onto the desk. "I've had the chief constable on the phone. The London papers are sniffing around. If we don't have a solid arrest by noon, it's my head on the block, and yours will be the first one I kick out the door." Hamish blinked slowly, looking like a cow contemplating a particularly difficult gate. "Och, sir, it's been a jay-long night. I am afraid I've made a bit of a mess of things." Blair's eyes widened. "A mess? What now? Did you lose the crime scene tape? Did you let a sheep eat the forensics?" "No, sir," Hamish sighed, gesturing vaguely toward the cell. "It's Geordie, the handyman. He came in late last night. Rambling he was. Something about wasp killer and kilts. I tried to follow your brilliant lead about the local connection, but I think I've confused the poor man. He's in there now, claiming he did it all." Blair froze. His predatory instincts, usually dampened by his own ego, suddenly sharpened. "He's in the cell? And he's confessing." "Aye, but it's all very muddled, sir," Hamish said, leaning back and scratching his red hair. "He keeps saying it was your intimidating presence at the hotel that broke him. Said he saw you looking at the bins with such forensic intensity that he knew the game was up. I told him he was havering, that you were far too busy with the London socialites to worry about a bit of local mud, but he wouldn't listen." Blair's chest began to swell, his buttons straining against his shirt. "Forensic intensity, you say? Well, I suppose I did spend a significant amount of time observing the hotel's perimeter. It's a matter of psychological pressure, Macbeth. A city man knows how to lean on a suspect without saying a word." "Is that what it is, sir?" Hamish asked innocently. "And here I was, thinking ID found these letters by accident. I was going to throw them out, thinking they were just old tourist brochures. But then I remembered your lecture on hidden compartments." Hamish pulled the waterproof pouch from under Blair's papers. "Are these the ones the London folk were asking about?" Blair snatched the pouch, his hands shaking as he peered at the wax seals. His face went from pale to a triumphant, glowing crimson. The sterling letters. My God, Macbeth. These are the missing pieces of the Blackwood and Finch puzzle. This is the career maker. Well, I am glad you found them, sir, Hamish said with a yawn. I'd have probably lost them in the post. It's lucky you left your notes right on top of them so I wouldn't miss them. Blair wasn't even listening anymore. Oh. He was already imagining the headlines in the Daily Record. DCI Blair cracks Highland cold case. Blair recovers royal secrets. Right, Blair barked, suddenly a man of action. MacNab, Anderson, get in here. We're taking the prisoner and the evidence to Strathbane. I'll handle the press conference myself. Macbeth, you stay here and... I don't know, wash your face. You look like a disgrace to the force. Will you be mentioning my help in the report, sir? Hamish asked, his voice full of hope. The super said if I did well on this one, I might finally be ready for that promotion to the Glasgow division. A desk job in the city, sir. Just what I've always dreamed of. Blair stopped at the door, his eyes narrowing. The last thing he wanted was Hamish Macbeth, a man who actually knew the truth shadowing him in the city, or, worse, being promoted alongside him. He needed Macbeth buried here, in the peat and the rain, where he couldn't accidentally reveal who really found the letters. Promotion? Blair scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Macbeth. You almost bungled the whole thing. If I hadn't left my notes for you to follow, you'd still be looking for that scarf. No, you're staying right here. In fact, I'll make sure the super knows that without my constant supervision, you're a liability. You're lucky I'm not demoting you to traffic duty in Ullapool. Hamish hung his head, the picture of a defeated man. As you say, sir, I suppose I am just not cut out for the big city. You're not cut out for a pair of trousers that fit, man. Blair laughed, a booming, arrogant sound. Now, get out of my way. I've got a promotion to accept. Hamish watched from the window as the police cruisers roared out of the square, sirens screaming for no reason other than Blair's vanity. He watched until the blue lights vanished around the bend of the loch, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and the returning silence. He turned back to the room, the vacant look vanishing from his eyes. He walked to the stove, picked up his pot of coffee, and poured a steaming mug. Well, Lugs, Hamish said, patting the dog's head. That was a close one. Another week, and we might have been looking at a flat in a tenement and a view of a brick wall. He sat in his chair, put his feet up on the desk, and looked out at the mountains. The royal scandal was gone, headed for a safe in London. Geordie was headed for a cell, though Hamish would make sure the local lawyers knew about the provocation. And DCI Blair was headed for a medal he didn't deserve, but was still here, Hamish whispered, the dry, sceptical humour returning to his voice. And I believe there's still half a salmon in the larder. Chapter 11. The piece of the peat smoke the following morning, Lochdubh looked exactly as it had for 300 years, and exactly as it likely would for 300 more. The mist had returned to its favourite haunts among the crags of the Swilvan, and the Andub River ran high and tea-coloured, swollen by the night's steady downpour. To the casual observer, the royal scandal might never have happened. Hamish Macbeth was back in his kitchen wearing an old moth-eaten sweater that Priscilla had once told him should be burned for the sake of public health. He was carefully flaking the remains of the poached salmon into a bowl for Lugs, who was waiting with the kind of soul-deep patience only a dog or a man hiding from the police can manage. The morning post had arrived, delivered by a beaming Mrs. Gillespie. She had lingered at the door, her eyes bright with the reflected glory of the village's sudden fame. "Have you seen the Strathbane Sentinel, Hamish?" she asked, thrusting a damp newspaper toward him. "There's a photograph of that DCI Blair looking like he's just conquered the North Pole. He's calling it the pinnacle of modern detective work." Hamish took the paper and spread it on the table. The headline was bold and unapologetic. Blair busts blackmail ring. Royal secrets recovered. Below it was a picture of Blair, his chest puffed out so far he looked like a pigeon in a suit, shaking hands with a representative from the London solicitors. "He's a very clever man, the DCI," Hamish said, his voice a model of Highland gravity. "It says here he used advanced psychological profiling to identify the suspect. I imagine that's a very difficult thing to do in the rain." "Fiddlesticks," Mrs. Gillespie scoffed. "He wouldn't know a profile from a pancake. But the village is quiet again, and that's the main thing. Even if poor Geordie is away to the cells. He'll be treated fair, Mrs. Gillespie," Hamish promised softly. "The lawyers are already talking about extreme provocation and the man's previous good character. He won't be seeing the inside of a prison for as long as Blair thinks." Once she had gone, Hamish turned his attention to the stove. The smell of fresh coffee began to fill the small station, a scent that, for Hamish, represented the very essence of liberty. He had avoided the city, he had avoided the promotion, and he had managed to keep his beloved drafty station for at least another season. The sound of a Carthy's one driven with far more grace than a police cruiser announced a visitor. Priscilla Halberton Smythe walked in, looking radiant in a dark green waterproof coat that probably cost more than Hamish Land Rover. "I see the hero of the hour is already being celebrated in the press," she said, nodding toward the newspaper. Just the local scenery, Priscilla," Hamish replied, pulling out a chair for her. "Blair is the hero. He told the super I was a stabilizing, if somewhat inert, element of the investigation." Priscilla laughed, a silver sound that made the small room feel suddenly brighter. Is that what we're calling it now? I spoke to Fiona Sterling before she left for London this morning. She told me to tell you that if you ever find yourself in Mayfair, you're to look her up. She thinks you're wasted here, Hamish. Hamish poured her a cup of coffee. London, is it? With the noise and the smog and the people who think a salmon comes out of a plastic packet. I think ID last about 4 hours before I started trying to poach the ducks in St. James Park. I told her as much, Priscilla said, her eyes softening as she watched him. But you did a good thing, Hamish. Geordie is a good man who did a terrible thing, but Van Smythe was a rotter. The village knows the difference. The village always knows, Hamish mused. That's the trouble with being a policeman in a place like this. You're no just enforcing the law of the land, you're enforcing the law of the people. And sometimes they didn't quite match up. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the ticking of the clock and the contented sighs of lugs. It was the kind of silence that existed only in the far north, a heavy, peaceful thing that felt like a shield against the rest of the world. When Priscilla finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. My father is having a small dinner party on Friday. He's still grumbling about the theatricality of the murder, but he'd like you to be there. He wants to hear the real story, even if he pretends not to believe it. I'll be there, Priscilla, provided I can find a clean shirt that hasn't been chewed by the dog. After she left, Hamish stood at the window watching her drive away. He felt a familiar twinge of loneliness, but it was quickly overshadowed by the profound sense of relief that comes with a narrow escape. He looked at the paperwork on his desk, the reports of sheep missing, and the application for new traffic Kennesand, felt a strange sort of affection for it. He sat back down, picked up a piece of the buttery salmon, and shared it with Lugs. "Well, lad," Hamish whispered, "the Sassenachs have gone, the DCI has his medal, and the mist is staying right where it belongs. I think we can call that a successful case." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain. The fire was low, the coffee was hot, and for the moment, PC Hamish Macbeth was the most contented man in the Kingdom of Scotland. Chapter 12. The law of the land and the lure of the river, the village of Lochdubh, had a remarkable capacity for absorbing drama and turning it into ancient history within the span of a single Sunday service. By the time the bells of the kirk had finished their mournful tolling the following weekend, the royal scandal was no longer a headline. It was merely a garnish for the morning's gossip, something to be discussed over tea and scones before moving on to the more pressing matter of the price of feed or the mysterious damp patch in the church vestry. Hamish Macbeth stood on the doorstep of the police station, breathing in the air. The rain had ceased, leaving the world sparkling and raw. The scent of peat smoke was heavy, drifting low over the rooftops, and the loch was a sheet of hammered silver. His first stop of the morning was the Taj Mahal of the north. Mr. Patel was busy polishing his front window, looking considerably more cheerful than he had when a corpse was occupying the village square. "A fine morning, Mr. Patel," Hamish called out, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't suppose the departure of the big men has improved the appetite of the locals?" Mr. Patel beamed, his gold tooth catching the light. "Mr. Macbeth, it is a transformation. Now that the sirens have stopped, people are remembering they are hungry. Even Mrs. Kennedy came in for a vegetable samosa. She said it was exotic, which I believe is her highest form of praise." "It is indeed," Hamish agreed. "And what of our visitor? Any more royal requests for roast beef?" Patel's face sobered. "None. It is a tragedy the way it ended. But as my father used to say, a man who walks with his head in the clouds should not be surprised when he trips over the truth. He was a man who did not understand that even a small village has its own gravity." Hamish nodded. That was the Highland way of saying Van Smythe had it coming. He bid Patel farewell and wandered toward the post office. He wasn't looking for gossip this time, he was looking for the official correspondence that usually followed a successful DCI Blair operation. Mrs. Gillespie handed him a heavy, cream-coloured envelope with the Strathbane Police Headquarters seal. She watched him with narrow, expectant eyes. "Is it the transfer, Hamish? Are they finally taking you away to be a commander in London? Hamish felt a cold prickle of dread. Oh. He retreated to the station, sat at his scarred desk, and tore open the envelope with the reluctance of a man opening a tax audit. Regarding the conduct of PC-102 Macbeth during Operation Royal Mist, the report submitted by DCI Blair highlights a significant lack of initiative and a continued reliance on unorthodox and sluggish methods. DCI Blair notes that while the case was solved with distinction by the Strathbane team, PC Macbeth's contribution was primarily ornamental and occasionally obstructionist. In light of this, the recommendation for promotion to the Criminal Investigation Department is hereby denied. PC Macbeth is to remain in Lochdubh indefinitely, pending further review of his commitment to modern policing standards. He is encouraged to attend a 3-day seminar on digital forensics for rural officers in Inverness next month. Hamish let out a long, slow breath. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in sympathy, and tossed the letter onto a pile of old newspapers. Inert, he whispered to Lugs, who thumped his tail against the floor. Ornamental. God bless you, Blair. You're a spiteful, arrogant, wonderful man. By painting Hamish as a useless village idiot to save his own ego, Blair had inadvertently granted Hamish the one thing he valued above all else: his freedom. There would be no desk in a grey office, no shouting superiors in shiny suits, and no need to wear a tie that didn't have a gravy stain on it. He was safe. He looked at the iron stove. The fire was crackling softly, the peat giving off a warmth that seemed to seep into his very soul. In the larder, he still had the other half of that poached salmon, along with some floury potatoes he'd taken in payment for helping a crofter find a lost cow. But as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of violet and gold, a familiar restlessness took hold of him. The digital forensics seminar could wait. The paperwork for the missing traffic cones could wait. The world was quiet, the DCI was gone, and the Andub River was calling. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, reaching for his old tweed cap and the collapsible fishing rod he kept hidden behind the door. The law is a grand thing, to be sure, but it dasna put a fresh supper on the table. They slipped out the back door, moving like shadows through the gorse. Hamish felt the familiar spring in his step. The lazy policeman suddenly transformed into a hunter. He knew exactly which pool the big trout favoured after a heavy rain, and he knew exactly how to stay out of sight of the estate wardens. As he reached the bank of the river, he paused. The Highland wind was cold, biting at his ears, but it felt clean. There was no more scent of bitter almonds, no more smell of expensive London perfume. There was only the mist, the water, and the ancient, sceptical silence of the hills. Hamish Macbeth cast his line into the dark, swirling water. He stood there, a lanky silhouette against the twilight, a man who looked like he was doing absolutely nothing at all, which, in Lochdubh, was often the sign of a man doing exactly what needed to be done. The peace of the Highlands had returned, and as long as the rest of the world thought he was a useless peasant, Hamish intended to keep it that way.